There is a strange kind of battery sitting quietly beneath your feet right now. It does not hum like a generator. It does not glitter like solar panels or spin like wind turbines. Most people walk across it every single day without realizing it exists. And the strange part is that this battery never runs out. It does not rely on lithium pulled from desert salt flats. It does not depend on cobalt mined halfway across the world. There is no factory assembly line stamping it into plastic cases or shipping it across oceans. Instead, it uses something far more ordinary: dirt, moisture, 2 pieces of metal, and a law of physics so simple that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Nearly 2 centuries ago, a Scottish inventor discovered that the soil itself can produce electricity. Not a weak spark, not a laboratory curiosity, real, measurable voltage drawn straight from the earth beneath a patch of coarse grass. By burying copper and zinc electrodes several feet underground, he managed to power telegraph equipment for long stretches of time, without fuel, without moving parts, and without a monthly bill arriving in the mail. Early scientific societies recorded the results carefully. Engineers repeated the experiments. Patents began to appear across Europe and North America describing similar systems. For a brief moment in the 19th century, it looked as if electricity might one day rise quietly from the ground itself. But then something strange happened. The patents disappeared into corporate archives. The research faded from textbooks, and the idea that the Earth could power devices slowly slipped out of public memory as if it had never existed at all. If you're the kind of person who enjoys rediscovering forgotten pieces of science like this, take a moment right now to quietly tap the like button or subscribe to the channel. Not because it helps an algorithm or grows a brand, but because every small signal tells me that these kinds of stories still matter to someone out there watching. Sometimes it really does feel like a conversation across a distance. One curious person speaking to another. To understand how this all began, we have to step back into the damp streets of 19th century Edinburgh, where a clockmaker named Alexander Bain spent his days repairing delicate gears and springs. Bain was not a wealthy inventor with a university laboratory. He worked with the kinds of tools you might find in any small workshop. But like many craftsmen of his time, he was fascinated by the new science of electricity. Telegraph wires were beginning to stretch across cities and countryside, carrying pulses of current that could transmit messages faster than any horse or train. One afternoon, Bain carried 2 metal rods outside behind his shop. The soil there was damp from recent rain. He pushed 1 rod of copper into the ground and another rod made of zinc several feet away. Then he connected a wire between them and attached the line to a simple galvanometer, a device used to detect electrical current. The needle moved. Not a tiny twitch either. It swung strongly to the side, showing that a steady flow of electricity was traveling through the wire. Bain repeated the experiment several times, changing distances, depths, and metal combinations. The result remained the same. The Earth itself was completing a chemical circuit. At its core, the principle is surprisingly straightforward. When 2 different metals sit inside a conductive environment, such as moist soil, an electrochemical reaction begins. The minerals and water in the ground act as an electrolyte, allowing charged particles to move between the metals. One electrode slowly releases electrons while the other receives them, creating a small but continuous electrical potential. Connect a wire between the 2 and those electrons begin to flow as direct current. For Bain, this was more than an interesting trick. It meant electricity could be generated without acid jars, spinning machinery, or fuel. The ground itself could serve as a giant natural battery. Within a short time, he filed a patent describing what he called an earth battery. His design used copper and zinc plates buried underground with wires leading back to telegraph equipment. Early demonstrations suggested the system could power communication lines steadily for long periods of time. Across the Atlantic, similar experiments soon appeared. Telegraph operators working in remote areas of the American frontier discovered that buried electrodes sometimes produced enough voltage to run their instruments without conventional batteries. In rural Pennsylvania, small stations reportedly used earth-based electrical cells to keep telegraph relays active through long stretches of wilderness where fuel deliveries were unreliable. Engineers noticed something intriguing. Once the electrodes were in place, the current often continued for years. If you find yourself thinking, wait, how have I never heard about this before? You are not alone. I remember the first time I stumbled across a reference to these experiments while reading through old engineering notes. I had to pause for a moment and double check that I was not misunderstanding something. If that same feeling of curiosity just hit you too, consider leaving a comment below and telling me what part surprised you. I read those messages more often than you might expect, and they often guide what stories I explore next. By the mid-1800s, the idea of drawing electricity from the soil had spread widely enough that multiple inventors began improving the concept. Some systems used long trenches, with electrodes spaced many feet apart. Others experimented with coils of metal buried deeper underground where moisture remained stable throughout the year. Reports circulated of telegraph relays operating for months or even years with minimal maintenance. The current produced by a single earth cell was modest, but connecting many cells together increased the voltage. The scaling worked in much the same way as ordinary batteries. One cell might produce less than a volt. 10 connected in series could produce several volts. Larger arrays stretched across fields or along telegraph lines produced enough energy to run communication circuits continuously because the system relied on the chemistry of soil and metal rather than stored chemicals. The electrodes sometimes lasted surprisingly long. By the late 19th century, another inventor entered the story, a farmer named Nathan Stubblefield, living in Kentucky. Stubblefield was fascinated with wireless communication long before radio broadcasting became common. He experimented with coils of iron and copper buried beneath the ground, exploring whether the earth itself could transmit electrical signals. Witnesses later described demonstrations in which voices traveled through the soil to receiving devices several hundred feet away. Newspapers reported that he had built a form of telephone that did not require traditional wires. During one public exhibition in the early 1900s, spectators reportedly listened to spoken words transmitted from equipment hidden beneath the earth of a public park. Whether every detail of those demonstrations unfolded exactly as reported is difficult to confirm today, but the excitement surrounding them was real. For a brief period, it seemed possible that the Earth might serve not only as a power source, but also as part of a communication system. Around this point in the story, I usually pause and think about how quickly certain ideas can vanish from public awareness. Technologies appear, spark curiosity, and then slowly fade as other systems take their place. Sometimes that happens because the alternatives are simply more practical. Large power plants and electrical grids eventually prove capable of delivering massive amounts of energy to growing cities. Compared with those systems, small Earth batteries could not compete in raw output. But the underlying chemistry never disappeared. The same electrochemical reactions continue quietly wherever metal and moist soil meet. Modern researchers studying soil conductivity have confirmed that measurable voltage differences appear naturally. Between different buried metals, moist clay soils often produce stronger reactions than dry sand because water and dissolved minerals help ions move more freely. If you were to build a small demonstration today using copper and zinc electrodes buried several feet apart, you would likely measure a fraction of a volt between them, connect several such cells together, and the voltage increases. The current remains relatively low, which is why these systems are usually discussed in the context of small electronics, sensors, or experimental setups rather than full household power. And that brings us to a practical point that often gets lost in sensational stories online. Earth batteries can generate real electricity, but the output is modest. They are not likely to run large appliances or replace a modern electrical grid. What they can do is demonstrate a fascinating piece of electrochemistry and provide small amounts of continuous power for low-energy devices. Imagine a small off-grid sensor in a remote forest measuring soil moisture or temperature. A buried pair of electrodes connected to simple electronics could potentially provide a slow but steady trickle of energy. In fact, researchers exploring environmental monitoring sometimes investigate similar concepts because the ground itself becomes part of the power system. If you've stayed with me through this entire story so far, I want to pause for a second and say something directly to you. The internet is full of loud voices competing for attention, but the people who watch long by thoughtful explorations like this are rare. If you feel that quiet curiosity pulling you deeper into these topics, consider subscribing, not out of obligation, but simply so we can keep exploring together the next time another forgotten idea surfaces. The deeper lesson here may not be about a single device buried beneath the soil. It may be about how knowledge moves through time. Some discoveries surge forward and reshape the world. Others linger quietly in forgotten patents and dusty research papers until someone rediscovers them decades later. The Earth's battery sits somewhere in that second category. It reminds us that the planet beneath our feet is not inert. Soil contains minerals, moisture, and microscopic processes that interact with metals in subtle ways. Under the right conditions, those interactions produce electricity, however small. Next time you walk across a patch of wet ground after rainfall, it might be worth remembering that countless tiny chemical exchanges are taking place just below the surface. Electrons are shifting between minerals and metals. Ions are drifting through thin films of water between soil particles. None of it is dramatic enough to light up a city skyline, but it is still part of the quiet electrical life of the planet. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of this entire story. The Earth has always been capable of participating in these reactions. Long before power lines crossed continents or batteries powered our devices, the same electrochemical principles were already unfolding silently in the ground beneath forests, fields, and backyards around the world. If this story sparked even a small sense of wonder for you, share it with someone who enjoys learning strange corners of science the way you do. Not because a video needs to travel far, but because curiosity spreads best between friends. And every once in a while, a forgotten idea deserves another moment in the light.